No Russian treated me as cruelly as his own Germans. How the Germans lived in Soviet captivity. During the Great Patriotic War, there were 3,486,206 prisoners of war in the camps of the GUPVI of the NKVD of the USSR, of whom 2,388,443 were Germans. The rest represented Germany's allies, Hungarians, Romanians, Italians, and others, including soldiers of fortune from various European countries. In this video, we will tell you how former enemies survived in the country they fought so hard against. The prisoners of war were distributed to 260 camps, where they were engaged in the restoration of destroyed cities, worked in mines, factories, and logging. Mass repatriation began only in 1953 to 1955. Life in the camps was hard. The prisoners worked hard, suffered from a lack of food, especially in the first post-war years, when famine gripped the civilian population of the USSR. However, compared to what the Red Army soldiers went through in Nazi concentration camps, the conditions of detention in Soviet camps were more humane. The figures speak for themselves. 85% of prisoners of war returned home, and 15% died in captivity. For comparison, out of 6 million Soviet soldiers who were captured by the Germans, only 1,836,562 people survived and returned to the USSR. The NKVD, relying on the experience of managing the Gulag system, effectively used prisoners of war as free labor. Even before the end of the war, prisoners were distributed to camps where they immediately began to work. We traveled for almost 5 weeks in a carriage to the Sverdlovsk region. On the way, we were given liquid soup, crackers, and salted dried fish. But there was almost no water, and sometimes they did not give it at all. At the stations, stones were flying into our carriages to shouts of "Hitler kaputt." People tried to get into the hatches. Many arrived at the scene and were so exhausted that they could not stand. They were loaded into trucks and taken to the camp, recalled former prisoner of war Kurt Werner Andres. In the camp, we were first sent to the bathhouse. Our hair was shaved off, our clothes were disinfected, although some were left without it. All personal belongings, watches, rings, photographs, were confiscated. A particularly difficult ordeal was the journey from the destroyed Stalingrad to the camp in Beketovka, now Kirovsky district of Volgograd, in February 1943. After the surrender of Paulus's 6th Army on February 2nd, German soldiers, exhausted by hunger and cold, went into captivity, which was later called the March of the Dystrophics. Exhausted prisoners, wrapped in any available clothing, including women's headscarves, fell right along the way, unable to withstand physical and nervous tests. However, most of the inhabitants of the USSR had no pity for them, especially the soldiers of the Red Army, who freed their comrades from the concentration camp in Gumrak. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, Paulus's army captured thousands of Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad, of whom at least 15,000 died of starvation. Against this background, the suffering of the German prisoners seemed insignificant to the Soviet people. No one disputes that the stay of German soldiers in Soviet camps was extremely difficult. In the first post-war years, hunger became one of the main problems. German soldier Herbert Bomberg recalled, "For a long time we were fed only once a day, a liter of soup, a ladle of millet porridge, and a quarter of bread. But the local population was starving no less. According to NKVD regulations, prisoners were to receive 400 grams of bread daily. In the first year, then the norm was increased to 600 to 700 grams, 100 grams of dried fish, 500 grams of vegetables or potatoes, 20 grams of sugar, 30 grams of salt, as well as tea, vegetable oil, and spices. However, in practice, these standards were often not respected, as some of the products were appropriated by camp staff. In addition, the distribution of food among the prisoners was uneven. The strong could take away most of the rations from the weak, which is not surprising in such conditions. The situation was complicated by conflicts between prisoners of different nationalities. Italians, Romanians, and Croats tried to stay away from the Germans and sought to take advantage of the camp kitchen, reducing the rations of their former allies. Romanians, in particular, are described in the memoirs of German soldiers as particularly active in such actions, which were called food terrorism. However, the Germans did not stay away either. Considering Romanians and Italians second-rate, they formed self-defense groups and, if possible, attacked the offenders, took away their food, and even broke out their gold teeth. Such teeth served as a kind of camp currency. They could be exchanged at the guards for food, for example, stew. In the harsh conditions of camp life, people often showed the darkest sides of their character. The desire to survive at any cost often became more important than friendship or comradely solidarity. German prisoner of war Heinrich Eichenberg recalled, "Hunger was the most terrible ordeal. For the sake of a plate of soup or a piece of bread, people were ready to do anything, even betray themselves and others. Hunger changed people, turning them into animals. Stealing or taking food from friends has become a part of everyday life." The Austrian historian Stefan Karner, who studied the fate of German prisoners of war based on their own memories, noted that working prisoners received relatively adequate food, at least 600 grams of black bread per day, and an additional 300 to 400 grams for exceeding the labor standard. This was sometimes more than the citizens of the USSR could afford during the difficult years of the famine of 1946 to 1947. The prisoners also had access to minimal medical care. The only medicines were camphor, iodine, and aspirin, and operations were often performed without anesthesia. Despite these conditions, many prisoners remember Russian doctors with gratitude, noting their efforts to help even in such a difficult situation. Karner wrote, "Some prisoners, such as Gerhard Schliephake and Bernhard Merschbacher, noted that the years spent in captivity had become a school of life for them. After returning home, they came to Russia more than once, maintaining warm and friendly relations with the locals." British historian Anthony Beevor, while working on the book Stalingrad, talked with German prisoners of war. They recalled the first years in captivity. "None of the Russians treated me as cruelly as their own Germans, especially those whom the guards appointed as guards and armed with wooden sticks to maintain order. Most often, they were former criminals. The Austrians tried to stay away, as if they had forgotten that they were Germans too. In response, they were often insulted, reminding them that Hitler, by the way, was an Austrian. The camps for German prisoners were practically no different from the camps for Soviet prisoners. Hundreds of people were housed in the barracks. They slept on wooden bunks. The workers' battalions, consisting of 500 to 1,000 men, were divided into 3 companies. Visual propaganda hung in the barracks: graphs, honor boards, labor competition. Participation in such events could bring an increase in rations. Another way to improve the conditions of detention was the opportunity to join the anti-fascist movement. To do this, the prisoners had to publicly renounce Nazi ideology, study Marxism-Leninism, participate in meetings, and agitate their comrades for socialist ideas. This is how the Soviet authorities sought to educate future supporters of socialism in Germany. As the economy recovered and famine was eliminated in the USSR, life in the camps gradually improved. The Germans, unlike Germany's allies, stood out for their discipline and conscientious work, which corresponded to their national character. There were no mass riots or disobedience on their part. Over time, the prisoners began to receive not only rations, but also a small salary, which they could send home to their families or save in Soviet banks. They were also allowed to receive 1 letter from home per month, and they could send letters without restrictions. When their clothes fell into disrepair, they were given free jackets, footcloths, and canvas boots. This was always enough in the Soviet Union.